Today is Friday, March 23rd, 2018, and this is day 2 of the Physical Therapy Board of California board meeting. We are meeting in the Department of Consumer Affairs hearing room located at 2005 Evergreen Street in Sacramento. Could we please have roll call?
Alicia Benaman,
Here.
T.J. Watkins,
Yeah.
Deborah Oviso,
Here.
Jesus Dominguez,
Present.
Daniel Drummer,
Present.
Katarina Ellaby,
Present.
Tanya McMillian.
Here.
All board members are present, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. We're going to start this morning with agenda item number 17, which is discussion and possible board action on FSBPT's performance evaluation tool. You do not have any materials in your agenda material books, but this was an item I asked to be placed on the agenda because we had a presentation by FSBPT last August at our board meeting from their representative, and I don't think we had any further discussion after we had that presentation. So wanted to just bring the topic back to the board to discuss and see where that goes this morning. Unless, Mr. Kaiser, do you have anything to add to that before we start?
Just like a frame of reference, shortly before the presentation from FSBPT about the performance evaluation tool, this board was considering regulatory language to update the current tool that the board uses. Currently, we use APTA's Clinical Performance Instrument, which is a rather outdated tool. APTA doesn't use this tool anymore. They have a more modern online version of it. But it is a tool that's called out specifically by name in regulation, so that necessitates a change. And while we were looking at modernizing to APTA's online process, FSBPT also has developed a very similar tool specific for foreign. And so the purpose of the conversations today is really kind of to talk about what the board's preference is moving forward in either continuing a regulatory change to APTA's more modern online process, or a switch maybe to FSBPT's online process, and the pros and cons to that. And, you know, based on questions, their staff and I are going to be able to answer some of those that are how the tools work and those kind of things, what we think is better. Essentially, from an administrative standpoint, for us, it's a draw. I mean, both tools are similar enough that they would not require more labor or time than the other. And so at this point, it really is up to the board to determine which direction we want to go in to make that regulatory change. I would say that a change is necessary at this point. The tool that we're currently using hasn't been used by APTA for quite a while, years even.
And I know the presentation was 8 months ago, so it's been some time. But if you'll remember at that time, we were reminded that the CPI was developed for and tested and validated for use for entry-level physical therapy students, not for foreign educated students. And during the presentation, there was a lot of justification for using a tool that has been proven valid and reliable for foreign educated physical therapists. It's also free, so there wouldn't be a cost to the supervisor or to the foreign educated physical therapist. Do any board members have any comments or are swayed one way or the other for going to the CPI online version versus the PET?
I have a question more so about as we revise our regulations, do we need to call out the specific tool by name, or can we just establish certain qualities that we're looking for in a tool so we have the flexibility moving forward to upgrade or move to a different provider if the board chooses that there's something else out there that's a better fit for us at the time?
Along that same line of thinking, if we're able to if we're able to choose the qualities, the pieces that we want to see, and allow the individuals to choose the tool that they're best able to access, or the one that they choose to that meets the basic qualifications that we're looking for, may provide some other supplemental information as well. But as long as we're achieving that, then I would worry about, should we be calling out any tool?
I apologize because based on what you just said, I think I had an elementary epiphany, kind of something that I should have thought of previously. To answer the question of whether or not we can not address a tool specifically and speak more about it content-wise, you can. It makes it rather difficult, though. There's a lot of analysis that needs to be done on an admin staff to make sure that that tool actually fits that criteria. That in and of itself can be pretty laborsome. But it hadn't really dawned on me until you just brought that up, that there's nothing that says that we can't call out both, either or. And kind of for that flexibility, that issue of addressing.
Has staff looked at the CPI and determined if that tool fits the criteria appropriate to evaluate a foreign educated physical therapist? It's my understanding that the tool, was developed for entry-level physical therapy students and also licensed for that purpose, not licensed for use for foreign educated physical therapists.
So the design elements that are designed specifically for foreign educated students are completely absent from APTA's CPI, their clinical performance instrument. It's designed specifically for domestic graduates. But I think something that's important to keep in mind is what we're trying to establish is equivalency of foreign applicants with domestic graduates. So while FSBPT has touched on those cultural and systematic points that a foreign applicant is going to need to know about the U.S. healthcare system, that is a little bit above and beyond what the APTA's clinical performance instrument is. And the reason I say that is because if what we're really trying to do is establish that equivalency, above and beyond might be an issue. I mean, it is a further point of discretion.
And these tools are evaluating the clinical aspect of the, in this case, the foreign trained therapist's capability. The tools are assessing, for APTA, the CPI is assessing the clinical capability of the soon-to-be matriculated student, soon-to-be graduated student. They may be even completed with all of their didactic, and they simply have to complete the clinical piece in order to receive their diploma. In my mind, I'm seeing that clinical evaluation piece as being very similar.
I think if I'm remembering correctly, the one part that the PET has is, like Jason mentioned, the piece where the foreign educated physical therapist must demonstrate that they can operate in the U.S. healthcare system. And so I think that's the difference. Not the difference. The PET is much more simple. It doesn't have as many items, as many criteria, but it's very specific and tailored to a foreign educated physical therapist, and it just doesn't have as many items as a new graduate of a DPT program.
I don't recall specific education about a professional operating within the healthcare aspects, the regulatory aspects, et cetera, in the U.S. healthcare system in my education program. There may have been, and I don't recall it, but I don't remember anything that specifically talked about when you have a patient who is covered by Medicare, these are pieces that might play into their aspects. Now, when I graduated from PT school with my master's in 1994, things are very different from what they are now with just regard to Medicare. So those regulations, those pieces, even if I did get them then, wouldn't be applying now. And so I don't, Dr. Dominguez, you being in education right now, do you know if there are is there any didactic work that looks at that for students?
Well, I mean, I can only speak about the program that I'm involved with USC. We do build that into the coursework in our evidence-based practice and professional development series. So it is addressed, but to your point, Dr. Drummer, I'm going back to 1988, and my curriculum certainly didn't, include any of the, what's being discussed today. So, and just from my perspective, the CPI really, that's sort of the assessment of the point of delivery in my mind. And so at that point, I think, domestic or foreign is really irrelevant to what the patient is receiving. So just to kind of throw that out there. And to Mr. Kaiser's point, are we sort of applying standards that are overly stringent to one population, not to the other? That's my thoughts.
And thank you. Based on that, I do want to stress that what's unsaid at that point is whether or not that's appropriate, right? That's the decision the board has to make, is that with the foreign population, is there something that necessitates that higher level of scrutiny for that component? And then having said that, there are, other pros and cons to kind of consider. We are and have been requiring for quite a few years now that any clinical instructor of a foreign trained student is APTA certified, and that training comes with the clinical performance instrument at APTA. Transitioning to the FSBPT's PET we'd have to find people that know how to use it. I want to kind of stress, and again, I apologize, I wish I had that idea before this conversation started, because there might even be materials I could provide to support this, but the idea of either or, to provide that flexibility, allows us also to access the current number of clinical performance or clinical instructors that are in the field today that are already certified, at the same time providing a level of flexibility for the foreign applicants to use a different tool. Doing this job, I learn something new every day. I didn't think I would, but I do. And one of those things is, while we've built the foreign education standards to mimic the CAPTE accreditation, I have learned that there's a false sense of security there, because, again, not all CAPTE accredited schools rely on APTA certified clinical instructors, nor do all, in totality, use the clinical performance instrument. Some of our graduates that are CAPTE graduates coming from other states, those states have their own evaluation tools. Which, again, I think lends kind of credence and support to that idea of more than one tool might be, providing greater access to the applicant.
And I took the CI training course last fall, and there was nothing in there on CPI training. It's all online. Yeah. So CIs for new graduates, go online and take the course. And again, I don't even think that that's mandated.
When you say there's nothing on the CPI, it's all online. The new clinical performance instrument's online.
The training for it.
The training's online, but is the training in reference on how to use the internet portal and evaluating your applicant? Okay, I just wanted to.
Yeah. But at the actual CI training course itself, it was more focused. There was nothing on that training.
Okay.
Yeah, it was more focused on interaction between the CI and the student. Yeah.
Are we aware of any challenges or difficulties with foreign educated therapists and using the CPI as referenced? I'm aware, I understand that needing to update the information is something that needs to be pursued, but have there been any problems, any challenges that we're aware of at this point?
Just one that's notable. The clinical performance instrument, the printed copy that we've used, that's now, as I've stated, antiquated. There are there are two basic components. One is kind of this numerical scale that we're asking the clinical instructor to kind of fill out on a continuum where they feel the applicant is in that process, and then a half a page or more, if they need it, of comments to justify that judgment. Every once in a while, the comments don't really line up with what's on the continuum, and it leaves our analysts in a predicament where we actually have to reach back out to that clinical instructor for more information because they almost contradict each other, which is frustrating, and it takes time. I mean, it's something that delays the foreign applicant's process that much more. The APTA's online version of the clinical performance instrument is much more definitive, and I think that came from feedback from that period of time. So as far as drawbacks, that's the current process. That's probably the main drawback, other than outdated, antiquated, that kind of thing, and not having the convenience of the internet portal to use. The printed copy, we have to provide it. APTA doesn't currently use it anymore, so it's essentially because we still have it called out specifically in regulation, we're providing those copies to the foreign applicants to give to their clinical instructors, which is probably the first time they've ever seen it, unless they've been around for a while and have done this since, before it went online. But as far as the difficulty it creates, that is the greatest difficulty, is just having to reach back out to that certified clinical instructor and ask for a little bit more information so that this board can make a determination of whether or not this applicant's ready for licensure.
And I would say, as having some experience in the Director of Clinical Education position and using the CPI with students, that we still currently, even with the electronic version, have those difficulties where a student might be scored at a certain point in the CPI, but the comment doesn't justify it. And so we do have to go back and, make some, try to make it make sense and see if that's exactly where the student's supposed to be, or if the comment, can be retracted for any reason, or if they've changed their mind. Maybe they wrote the comment 2 weeks ago and the student has progressed since then, kind of a thing. So we still have the same challenges with the CPI online as on paper. Yeah.
Alicia, I think I understood you that the CI training that you did, do you see that it could be beneficial no matter which tool was being used, based on the fact that it wasn't about that document, but it was about clinical instructor?
I do. I think that the CI training is beneficial for anyone who's going to supervise a student or a foreign educated physical therapist. Should it be mandated? I've seen enough cases where the CI did not go through the training and were superb CIs. So I do think the training can be helpful. I'm not sure that mandating it is necessary.
I think I wanted to make sure that if I understood you, that it isn't so tied to the CPI that we have to be concerned about whether that requirement would or wouldn't be helpful anymore.
In my experience last fall, there was barely a mention of the CPI, and it was more on interaction with the student in CI. Yeah.
In my dealing with the tools themselves, they are fairly explanatory, and they all have help sections of the tool. So if there's you get stuck on something, it's fairly obvious in the process what the next step is. So I could see where I find more value in the instruction about really the interaction between the instructor and the applicant being more important, really, than an extensive training of how to use the tool. And I think at that point, right now, there's no mandate that this board has imposed on the CAPTE accredited schools to have all of the instructors be APTA certified as a clinical instructor. But we do currently have that for foreign trained.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if the reason why there wasn't a lot of discussion about the CPI at the training is because certain schools choose not to use the CPI. So not all schools use it.
And after doing a little research after that epiphany, the CAPTE rules clearly call out that essentially it's really up to the school at that point to determine whether or not an applicant is ready for, a confirmation of degree. It's up to them. And however they want to assess that is up to them. CAPTE provides it as guidance. Here is a way to assess, and use this. The clinical experience is really just called out in hours, a minimum of such and such hours, not how that assessment or evaluation should occur.
As far as the U.S. healthcare system, I think when I've thought of that, I haven't thought of it as so specifically as like Medicare regulation, but just all of our education had that inherently woven through it. And that's what I think has been a concern, whether it comes down to kind of just what the rules are and the kind of the hierarchy rules, the ethics that go behind it. I think that's been some of the specific things that were concerns that we didn't know how to address with foreign educated, because it isn't woven into it. It doesn't occur here, so.
And the clinical requirement for foreign is extensive. We're talking about 9 months. There is a waiver for ethics of 3 months. And if they are licensed in another state, we'll waive their work experience month for month for that 9-month requirement. Being a regulatory agency, very much the fashion of the way we do things is very incremental in change. And I think that approach is appropriate here as well, where, switching from one to the other is a fairly significant change. But the addition of a tool for us to use and vet and have a period of time to measure and assess, I think adds to that incremental change idea, and could give us an opportunity to determine which tool is best. And at one time we find that one is far superior to the other, then maybe another regulatory change, might be appropriate at that point. For foreign trained applicants, I still think there is a huge value in requiring that APTA certified clinical instructor certificate. I think that it's the board's ability to make sure that the licensee who has now either volunteered or what have you has signed an agreement to become that applicant's instructor, we now have some reassurance in their skills and what they're able to do as that instructor. So that's something I would encourage that we keep.
Would that at all be a barrier to licensure that we don't place on our U.S. trained physical therapists?
Admittedly, I think you could see it that way. For both parties involved, both domestic graduates and foreign trained, there is a shortage of clinical instructors. That's irrefutable. I get that feedback from schools all the time. And I think that shortage has kind of, in the CAPTE, in the U.S. school setting, has driven using clinical instructors that don't have that certification. The demand is just there, and so if there are long-tenured physical therapists owning their own practice, working in clinical hospital settings, those kind of things, that are willing to volunteer to do it. And as Alicia alluded to, some clinical instructors without that special certification are excellent clinical instructors, that's driven the demand. Again, that was an epiphany that I had to, come to grips with, that while I'm enforcing that regulation on the foreign application population, and the assumption is that it's being adhered to on the domestic side, ignorance is bliss at that point. It's an eye-opener. Is it a barrier to licensure? It has been, I guess, is the best way to answer that. And that requirement is there. And I think justifiably so, for what I mentioned before. It is our ability to vet. For the U.S. side, there's a couple other mechanics in place that address that. The whole CAPTE certification process that the schools go through, and the inspection and those kind of things that we can rely on. And at that point, I guess the other concern that I would look at is, do I have any statistics or cases of concern that have come to light based on that, and in any kind of great number to assume that there's a problem in the school system in the U.S. with not using APTA certified clinical instructors. And admittedly, I don't have that kind of information, to create that thought.
I would ask the folks that are involved in education, I also think that there's different things that happen with the clinical evaluation for a student in a CAPTE program, that it might go through the clinical director. There's more interaction that occurs, so that I could see that the CI that maybe didn't go through a course would also have feedback from a clinical person at that program, whereas we're kind of bypassing that with a foreign educated. You're taking that.
Yeah, it's a much more integrated team on the CAPTE side, and having that assurance of a clinical instructor on the foreign side, because that team's not there, I think is our counterbalance.
Yeah. So I don't know that it makes more of a, I don't know that it makes a barrier. It's just a different system of the same kind of check and balance.
I would just add, so for example, in our process, there's the interaction between the student and the clinical instructor. We as faculty also check in, usually at the midterm point, check in with the student, check in with the CI, and then there's a third layer, or a third level, I should say, and Alicia, you probably know about this, the Director of Clinical Education, who ultimately adds that final layer of, I guess, quality assurance or vetting. So there's several layers in existence.
I have a question. And my question is, so if we have all these CIs that are overseeing the students, and the program is 9 months long, is some of this inherent in the actual CI's guidance of the student through this process, where they become aware of like the nuances of the culture and various other information that cannot be captured on paper? Because this was my assessment the last time when I was listening to the presentation of FSB to BPT. My first note was the samples were too small, that it was a work in progress. And they are trying to solve a problem, and the way you solve the problem, there's a way to solve a problem where you have some distance on it, but you're not a practitioner in it. And you rely on those practitioners to give you the feedback. And yet there's an existing system, maybe outdated, needs to be revamped, that has an existing platform and say a rollout. All the CIs are certified, and the whole deal. So you have an infrastructure in place. That's what's missing on the PET, is that there's not an infrastructure in place yet, but they're hoping to develop that. And my opinion at that point in time was already this needs more rollout because it needs more testing. So the other opportunity, and then when Jason was mentioning the equivalency, and they're seeking a standard that is an excellent standard, but it's not the equivalency standard. That is also when I start saying, okay, you're sitting on the outside and you want to solve the problem. So the first thing you go for is excellence. When you are from the outside, you always want to solve that problem at the excellence level. But when you come on a regulatory side, there has to be a fair play. And that's where that breakdown. So that's where those questions come into play for me. And mostly, I just wanted to know, what is the process? I am very curious about if there is no problem, so to speak, there's no cases, then the 9-month relationship between the CI and the student, walking them through this process, is probably working. I'm going to make that assumption based on no information, by the way. It's probably working, but until we have data, we will see what is working specifically and what is not working specifically. And I'm very curious, and I know FSB PT want to solve the problem, but the problem they want to solve they want to create a solution for where they see a problem, because they see they can do a better job than APT, right? And they probably can from an outside further perspective. But once you're in it, the game changes slightly, because you're in a regulatory environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see, that's that fine line all the time. I would love to solve problems here, big time. But then you sit in the regulatory environment and you know your parameters. And then that incremental aspect, that incremental gains is what we need to value. So I'm just open to having that discussion more.
You make a very good point regarding necessity. What are the issues, and do those issues necessitate a change? There is this an inference, if you will, that, and I consider it, I classify it one way, and I classify it as it would be nice, right? It would be nice to address the cultural issue. We all assume that there must be one, transitioning to the U.S. But as a previous manager over that unit and having to interact with the clinical instructors, the 9-month period, and even the 6-month at that point, that exists today using even the antiquated tool works. There are instances, there are times where the clinical instructors have reached out to us after a fairly short period of time, 30 days, 45 days, with feedback of, do I really need to do this for 5 more months? This person's more than qualified. They're teaching me, because we are talking about some people coming from, outside of the United States with decades of experience transitioning to the U.S., and the process, the transition itself seems seamless. They go through the process, and this instructor is in some ways being instructed, is a far superior intellect in having to review them. Having said that, TJ also brings up a very good point of the difference between excellence and minimum competency, right? And being cognizant that adhering to a higher standard for one of the categories is a barrier to licensure at that point. In our review of both tools, they are really quite similar up to that cultural point. Does the cultural point really need to be addressed? I don't have any kind of enforcement data to provide to you that it has created an issue. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't, but I don't have the data to say. I can attribute these violations at a higher concentration, per capita and licensing population to such variable.
Do you mean you don't have the data, or you haven't mined it to look for it?
No, we have the data, and in mining it, it doesn't present itself. The other issue that I would say is one of the advantages or one of the disadvantages, I think you could see it either way, to the APTA clinical performance instrument is its prevalency, right? Those APTA certified instructors that we rely on to train our foreign oftentimes are the same instructors that operate in the CAPT accredited schools or are volunteering their practice or so forth. So there's a existing population that we rely on today. A general switch too would now disqualify, well, not disqualify, some of them would choose not to do it because they're already doing it in CAPT schools, so it's very easy for them to take on a foreign educated student in the same kind of environment and do it for them as well. Having to do a different tool might be different. The reason I say that is since the last time we spoke about this topic, one of the things that we tried to do is find volunteers who are willing to do both. So through that process of applying and the applicant finding a clinical instructor, our staff has asked that clinical instructor, would you mind using both tools? No one has volunteered to do that. That's a lot of work. And we knew going in that we might find those few that were willing to make that leap. And I think moving forward, we might find one or two. But we haven't found one yet up to this point.
If I could speak from some experience with feedback on the CPI, in general, CIs hate it. I don't know if you've had the same feedback, Dr. Dominguez, but CIs, yeah, it's a lot of work, it's very cumbersome, and even though they've taken the training and it's a validated tool, I know looking at the CPI for a cohort of students, it's not being used the same way. It's all over the place. Even though CIs take the training online, it's still not used properly. However, with the comments below, we're able to make some reconciliation and get a gist of how the student's really doing. I wonder if offering a clinical instructor a second tool might make them just say, oh, wait a second, the first one's, for some of them anyway, the first one is lengthy and it takes a lot of time to do, because it does take a lot of time to do, to fill out a CPI. I don't know if any of you have, filled out a CPI before, but it takes some time. And they have to do it twice, once at midterm and once at the end. So it's just my 2 cents on the feedback that I've received from clinical instructors about it.
I think it's valuable. I think that's one thing to consider in that incremental change that I was talking about, is if we offer both, that might be something that we find on the other end, is that a good majority of the APTA certified clinical instructors have chosen FSBPT's model because it creates that simplicity. It's easier to use and there's a more definitive outcome. And that being the case, that might be something that we'd be back here again in the future to look at, to make another change. And I've gotten that same kind of feedback. I'll tell you, in just our interpretation of using those tools, we have the same frustration. Again, it's time consuming, it's laborsome, and it's not always as definitive as we need it to be.
Mm-hmm.
As a clinician, who's filled out the CPI for students that have been with me in the hospital, it does take time. It is a lengthy document. It's a lengthy evaluation. But I actually see value in the time my time that it takes to be able to fill that out, to be able to accurately describe the student's performance and to help the director of clinical education at the school to understand where the student is in their preparation for clinical work, and the student being able to advance through their education program, identifying pieces that may need a little bit more work. I know firsthand that there are a number of clinicians who are still not trained to be, they're not certified clinical instructors, because that's another step. That's not really that's not the particular aspect that we're talking about right now. We're talking about the tool that they should use. And the new tool is not covered with the credentialing of a clinical instructor at this point. That's a separate online module that is being used. And so it's a different piece of the puzzle that hopefully APTA is getting feedback about the CPI, and that they're making modifications for just the education piece, the online webinar type course to help explain how to use the CPI. But having a thorough evaluation of a student's performance, covering all of the different aspects of the student's behavior, the student's ability to recognize the problems in the clinic, with that the patient needs to have addressed. To me, that's a very valuable thing. That it takes time is an okay thing. The challenge is that the clinician needs to be a clinician. Mm-hmm. And in cases of private practice especially, that's taking time away from the clinician being able to treat a patient and get paid for treating the patient. Because nobody's paying the clinician for being a CI and for taking that time. That's professional obligation that the CI is taking on themselves. So I salute all of the CIs who choose to do that, because it is a lot of work without compensation, other than the idea of helping to support the future of the profession and helping to protect, from our aspect, helping to protect the public, so that the students are learning what to do and they're actually providing good, appropriate care. So I see value in the training, absolutely, as that aspect of it. And I see value in the depth of what the CPI does. I don't recall the specifics of the PET and how long that is. But if it's similar, from what Mr. Kaiser has said, then I would say if we can look at doing options or allowing both or similar, whatever language we can do, then I would say we could move forward in that direction.
Could I ask Dr. Drummer a question? So Dr. Drummer is a CI. Would you be willing to learn just learn a new tool, right? To be able to provide that flexibility for the applicant? That puts a little bit of the burden on you.
It does. If I'm willing, and my clinic setting does not take foreign educated therapists for their clinical training. But if I was willing to do that, then it is another piece of work, and I can understand why clinicians would not want or would be reluctant to fill out two tools in a testing time period. There may be clinicians out there, though, who have had experience with the CPI or don't want to use the CPI, who, if the PET was available, they may choose to do that. So allowing the option, I think, might be a helpful thing.
In our attempt to ask clinical instructors to do both, there are certain, it takes a special kind of person that holds this license to do this, to contribute. It's their way to contribute back to the profession, if you will. So we were familiar with certain names that we thought, well, we'll try to twist their arm a little bit. So, and for those that I'm fairly certain they enjoy this process, they think that it has value, that's why they participate in it. It was enough of a deterrent even for them at that point that even with some gentle, oh, come on, didn't you? Didn't really play out right.
How many folks are in clinical practice at any one time, or in an annual basis? Yeah, that would be under what we're discussing.
I'll have to defer to staff, but in my recollection, we've had numbers as low as 80 at any one time, but we've also had numbers, in the 2s and 300s at the same time, because you're talking about that 9-month transition, so there's a lot of overlap. So while some people might be towards the end of it, it depends on how the applications come in, really.
Because if I look at the licensing, the application numbers aren't too high.
No, and part of what contributes to that is they might have to do it more than once, or they weren't able to pass the exam, and that stretches out the application time itself. Foreign applications are very difficult to establish a performance measure because a lot of it is really based on the applicant's performance and participation in the application process. So not being able to pass the exam adds to the length of that time. And so we have some that are pending, is the best way to put it, for a longer period of time than you would think. 400, 500 days, that kind of thing.
And so the numbers that that we see in reports as far as applicants, foreign trained applicants, that doesn't, that's inclusive of those who have just started their application, we're currently reviewing the information to see if they have education equivalency, et cetera, and then also those who are in their 9-month clinical time?
So what you see in the statistics are the applications received
Yeah.
and the applications licensed. What you don't really get to see is that kind of pending that's in between. And that's, it's a difficult thing to report, and it's not even a really valuable statistic even at that point, because it doesn't speak to our ability to process these applications as a performance measure. That applicant might be in their second, third attempt of the exam, which again stretches, between 3 months and 6 months, or they've now passed the exam and they're either seeking a clinical instructor or they are in their clinical instructor. So that stretch of time is really on them. It's part of their participation. But in your agenda materials, what you see is just the flow, the applications that were received during that period of time, and then the ones that we were able to close out during that period of time.
Are we able to tease out the number of foreign trained applicants who are in their 9-month clinical?
We are. Oh, in the 9-month clinical, we could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I think at this particular moment, I feel like the PET is in a testing phase, because if we have to, sell it, then not enough of the profession has heard of it and are excited about doing it as they, give back to the profession. And I think maybe that's a long shot or a big request, but that's part of why they developed PET, so that they could facilitate this process of getting foreign trained PETs on board or onboarding in the U.S. I think with the incremental move, you still leverage your infrastructure, your rollout, all the people that are currently doing it, and then allowing simultaneously as FSBPT gets more numbers behind us, they will see things, because they'll do the research, that we will also discover, because I think our numbers will be very much equivalent to their research numbers, if not more. And so we will learn simultaneously. And that could be a conversation to develop the PET even more downstream. But I just don't, for me, just with the information that I have right now, I see it more as there's still more work to be done from this perspective, this regulatory perspective. Solving the problem is one thing, but from this regulatory perspective. And so, that's where I'm sitting right now, but I'm open to listening.
In where you are now, does the incremental change idea work for you? Accepting it as a second form?
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
because that's the only reason that I ask is the unfortunate circumstance for FSBPT is this is, for a good majority of the jurisdictions in the United States, called out specifically in their laws and rules. And so those states are only taking the clinical performance instrument or, the online version of the clinical performance instrument for their foreign trained. And it's really difficult to get a new product really at that point when there's already a competitive product on the market that's required by regulation. So,
But you're talking about 6 states who require supervised clinical practice. Yeah, so not all states even require supervised clinical practice,
No.
which I'm glad we do.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad we do.
And that's a good point, because, we're talking about it's one of those nice to haves. If there's a concern, California has addressed that concern by having a 9-month clinical requirement for all foreign trained applicants or an equivalent through, work experience month for month.
I have a quick question, maybe for Dr. Drama. During that, because he's the CI of CIs, so so in this 9-month, when you do this, I'm very curious. What have you found, just in a nutshell, well, so to speak? What has been your experience when you come across foreign students that you are guiding to onboarding them into the profession, if you will?
So I have never worked with a foreign trade student to try to through a clinical period. I have only worked with students who are currently in a CAPTE accredited program who are working on their clinical time. So I can't speak to the foreign educated piece. I've worked with students who are very early in their education period, within their first years, and those are typically just very short time. CPI is not required for those very short duration. And then I've worked with students for a period of, I think, as long as 12 weeks. And CPI is required for those students. But even seeing those long-term students in the clinical setting where I work in a level 1 trauma facility, sometimes it's very challenging for them to kind of get up to speed because of the intensity of what they're seeing in the environment where I work. Others fall into that relatively quickly. And it's a matter of just allowing them to see as many experiences as they can, because I see that's what my role is as a CI, to have that be an education for them. And I know that there are CIs who see the clinical period as more of a test of the things that they've learned. And so they're testing them along the way to see how they're able to apply what they've learned. I have a little bit of a different perspective that this is an educational experience with their clinical time, and trying to help them, to guide them through all of those different aspects, all of the different challenges that they're going to see with the multitude of patient comorbidities that are going along with whatever we're seeing. So there's a great variation in the academic programmed students that we're seeing that go through.
I think,
Thank you.
and that demonstrates that the system that we have employed for licensure works.
Mm-hmm.
These graduates are coming out of the program at the minimum competency level. Dr. Drummer works in a highly specialized area, so that might explain why it takes a little bit of time for them to come up to speed, which I think is a natural expectation. To answer TJ's question about some of those differences, some of those differences that have been expressed to us through just the application process alone, the different levels of autonomy. The education in a foreign country might be a direct access country coming to the United States. They have to adjust. We find those same differences in multi-jurisdictions in the U.S. Some students coming from a CAPTE accredited program in a state that has direct access have that mindset, when they come into California anyway. So it's a difference, but it's not a difference that we don't also see in the U.S. graduates. And then something that I think hasn't been part of the conversation, but I feel I have to tell you is, while we use the 1997 through 2006 antiquated, clinical performance instrument tool, APTA is specifically aware of that and has approved it for those states for foreign application use. Essentially, for a very long time, it was the only tool available at that time. To move to the modern online system, there's a subscription that's required the schools use with through CAPTE. So there's some other things to consider logistically about how that plays out. Where we're looking for that modernization, it's not necessarily to say that there's another written material alternative. APTA's CAPTE level accreditation right now is online and modern, but they are aware and okay with and have approved our ability to use it for foreign applicants.
And so I want to say that I agree with and appreciate Dr. Drummer's statements about the value of the CPI with students. And I heard you mention the word student in that short discussion numerous times. And so we want to appreciate the fact that these are physical therapists, trained physical therapists from another country. They're not entry-level students. I do have a problem with using the CPI that was designed for entry-level students. If we were to take the incremental step of offering both, that would be an option. I'm kind of thinking about Katarina's question of, do we have to spell it out? Can we say a tool designated or approved by the board instead of saying a tool itself?
Essentially, approved by the board is what you would put in regulation. And I'll defer to Sawa on this a little bit. My experience is there are some other aspects of regulation where I thought it would be more flexible for the board to say something similar to that. And the answer was, essentially no. It has to be incorporated by reference and specific. And the reason being, while it doesn't really pertain to this because there's only one version of the tool, regulation has to be so specific to point out to the end user, the people that are the stakeholder involved here being the applicant, knows that this tool and this tool only, not a previous draft, a previous revision, those kind of things. And so that's why that specificity is in regulation. We would have to, where we could outline the content kind of thing. I don't know. I'll let Sawa chime in on that.
I think the regulation does need specificity. You see it, for example, with documents, applications. You've heard before that you can't just say an application approved by the board. It either has to describe the content of the application or identify the application, the version of the application. I, of course, would want to look into it more, but based on that experience, I would say that probably specificity here is what's needed as well. But it's noted, I've heard several board members identify an interest in, leaving it more open. So when, if the board wants to move forward in drafting some kind of regulation to modernize the tools, we would work with Mr. Kaiser and his staff to see, okay, what kind of language would work. Since it's noted that the board seems interested in open language, we'd look at that more and determine whether or not specificity is required. But right now, I'm leaning towards saying yes.
And to be the devil's advocate, there's just one thing I would ask the board to consider. When you do leave the language that broad, you kind of open that as an invitation for people to submit what they think is equivalent to be considered, which also can be a very, through experience, a very wasteful use of the board's time. I mean, if you've set a standard but you provided an open opportunity to provide an alternative to that standard, there's still an evaluation to make sure that, it meets the content of that standard.
I would also say we may end up that it has to be specific anyway, but there's definitely a case for that an applicant should be able to create and recognize what standard they're going to be held to, and
Right.
calling out those documents does that.
Yep.
And also thinking that you can identify the elements of it as soon as you do it, and it gets put in, there will be an exception. It'll be on a napkin with a rating system
Yeah.
because it meets the criteria. And so I think it's an unintended.
Yeah, even in a simpler analogy using the applications, a simple document that the form shall contain name, address, phone number, email, and you go through that whole process. The minute that you add another element that you didn't include in the regulation, you're now outside of the authority of the regulation, right? Then it becomes an underground regulation document. So I think, I would also just caution the idea of being more open in content or even pursuing it. I think, again, going back to that kind of incremental idea, providing another alternative right now are, one, the tried and true alternative or the tried and true process we have today that we know of that might require some, slight tweaking, but this new alternative that is third-party validated and addresses the concern of foreign coming to the U.S. and those kind of things, but is also very similar in the actual assessment of those students to the CPEI, that we should consider.
I'm a little concerned about the potential cost of the CPI the online CPI.
Yeah.
To both the supervisor and the applicant, the foreign educated physical therapist. And I think in schools that the school purchases a CPI account and then, assigns the clinical instructors and the students and pairs them up. I don't know if there's a mechanism for one individual to buy, an account, or if that would fall on the clinic or the applicant or both.
Right,
or if
and
that-
those are some of the logistics I think we need to iron out in looking at that. And then having said that, maybe all three are the alternative too. The existing paper form, the CPI. To say that they have access to it is one thing. To require it is another, right? If they can't access either the FSBPT web portal, and there's something to say about creating that access too. The paper form may be more accessible for, a rural area or something along those lines, where the online portal creates a frustration that we have heard of on the U.S. side of things, issues where the portal has crashed or it's not available, and APTA is aware of it, so they have a contingency plan. The contingency plan essentially falls back to the paper form to be used until the portal comes back up and that data can be entered into the portal. So accepting all three is kind of an ideal situation.
Any further discussion?
In the spirit of moving towards some sort of action, but allowing discussion to continue, I move to direct the executive officer and board staff to develop language for modification of regulations regarding the evaluation of the supervised clinical practice of foreign educated therapists.
To include what was,
I'm leaving it open for
okay.
the executive officer and board staff to provide options or potential language for us to be able to look at
Absolutely.
at a future date, so that we can then decide which, we will have more information and be able to make decisions about which options may be better for us to do.
I would happily second that.
Can we read back the motion so that I
Yes,
can
ma'am.
get it down?
I move to direct the executive officer and board staff to develop language for modification of regulations regarding the evaluation of supervised clinical practice of foreign educated therapists.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Should it be therapist applicants?
Thank you.
Can I modify or amend or suggest an amendment for both PT and PTA?
That fine with you, Dr. Drummer? Yeah. Dr. Dominguez? You still second?
Yep, I second the second.
Any further comment from the board?
I just have one quick one. I'm still wrestling with this. So I guess at its root, do we as a board feel confident that all of these tools, the words equivalency and ensure excellence, but we have to really rely on minimum competence. Are we comfortable with these two tools being interchangeable? Because that's really what we're saying. If we give the option out there, then we're essentially saying that these two tools are equally as effective in getting to what we want to have happen.
My immediate response would be that I have full faith in the executive officer and board staff to be able to determine what equivalencies there might be or might need to be addressed, and to be able to present that to us when we have language that will be able to do it. I don't know that it's, without having a side-by-side comparison right now,
Right.
I don't feel like I can make any kind of statement in that way. So I'm trusting that with their research and evaluation of those, better evaluation of those tools side by side, that they will bring us language that we could be able to make decisions on.
I mean, myself never having used the PET, I had it open now. It's sort of a yes or no, whereas the CPI is sort of a Likert scale, a sliding scale. So I'm just wondering how that plays out in comparing the two tools.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. I've never used the PET either, only looked at them, separately. But I go back to TJ's question when he was asking Daniel about, his experience with a foreign educated physical therapist, and Daniel is a CI, but I almost wish there was someone here who had that experience, who could give us feedback.
I can tell you that both systems were designed to assess minimum competency in concept, and kind of alluding to, or going back to a comment that Dr. Drummer made, for him it's very clear that what he's doing is assessing at minimum competency and using it as a tool for education, where some clinical instructors are applying, through their own reasoning, kind of a more academic excellence standard. And we see that. I mean, some CPI reports that we receive are better than others, and we can see the level that they're being held to. But I think you would run into that problem with either, right? That's more about the instructor themselves than the document that they're filling out. But by design, both were established or were created to establish minimum competency.
Yeah, I also feel like when we do this exploratory research, something interesting is going to happen, because the PET was developed from a base of something. And I think it was developed of I don't know, but the base of this existing system. And then it was improved, and once we have the actual research in front of us doing the comparison, we will make that determination. Because right now, someone else has made that determination. And we have to make that determination based on where we are sitting from in this regulatory space, not out of the research space that has given us blind information, but given us information without the real context. We have the real context here with actual data that we have within the state of California that we can now run it up against. And I think that will give us the best way to make a decision about what that's going to be. That's final thoughts.
Any further board discussion? Well, hearing none.
So before we move into public comment, I want to make sure there were a couple of refinements to the motion. So I wanted to just read it back and confirm that I have the language correct. I move to direct the executive officer and board staff to develop language for modification of regulations regarding the evaluation of supervised clinical practice of physical therapists and physical therapist assistant applicants.
After supervised clinical practice of foreign educated physical therapist applicants for both PT and PTA.
And then I'd like to amend my amendment. You can remove PTA. There is no clinical instruction for PTA.
I
not
open up a
necessary.
can of worms every time I read it.
Actually, I recommended it trying to be consistent, not even thinking about the requirements are different at that point. This wouldn't be something that's required for a physical therapist.
Are we okay
assistant
with that?
applicant.
Okay, so it's I move to direct the executive officer and board staff to develop language for modification of regulations regarding the evaluation of supervised clinical practice of foreign educated physical therapists
Period.
Applicants.
applicants. Okay.
Yeah.
There.
Period. Okay. Do we have any public comment about this matter? Roll call vote.
Alicia Benjamin,
Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Deborah Alviso,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katarina Ellaby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian.
Aye.
Motion carried, 7-0.
All right. Let's move on to agenda item number 20, which is Consumer Professional Associations and Intergovernmental Relation Reports. We do not have a representative from FSBPT, but perhaps, Mr. Kaiser, do you have anything to update us on?
I do not on their behalf, no.
Yeah. Okay. DCA. Which one is that? Oh, here.
Right. Good morning.
Good
Morning.
I think it's still morning, right? Yep. Good morning. My name's Karen Nelson, Assistant Deputy Director with Board and Bureau Services with DCA. It's nice to see you, most of you, again since last November's board meeting, and thank you again for providing us an opportunity to share some updates and activities with the department. So the first thing I would like to share is we have a new Deputy Director of Legislative Affairs, Mr. Dennis Cuevas Romero. He started with the department March 12th, and before coming to DCA, he was Government Relations Director at the American Heart Association, American Stroke Association in Sacramento since 2016. He was Legislative Associate at Hernandez Strategy Group from 2013 to 2016 and a postgraduate law clerk at the Sacramento Regional Fair Housing Commission in 2012. I hope you join us in welcoming him to the department, and he does intend to contact our programs to see how he can be of service to you all and formally introduce himself. The next thing I wanted to go over is some recent activities at the department. Earlier this month, we did graduate our inaugural cohort of the Future Development Leadership Program. 12 of those individuals completed their eight-month leadership development training with Solid, as well as some mentorship with our executive officers, and also completing a team project in which they covered some areas for the department, such as communication, licensing, and barriers to licensure. And actually, this past Wednesday, we had our board member orientation training. And the next few dates, I believe I shared this with you all last time, are June 6th, September 18th, and December 5th. And I'm trying to see if any of you need that at the moment. Upon a quick scan, I don't believe anyone is in need of the board member orientation training. But if you are wanting to come and share that day with us, again, we welcome you to do so. Next month, April 30th, is the director's quarterly meeting with its board executive officers and bureau chiefs. And as you all know, that those quarterly meetings are a time in which to ensure that the director is present and can hear any issues or challenges you may have at the board. The last couple of things I wanted to share are two new items that the department is looking at. One is Solid's board member and executive boot camp. I believe that last November when I was with you all, you were asking about some trainings for board members. And so Solid does now offer additional training and team building specifically geared to board members, committee members, executive level board and bureau staff. And these courses are designed to improve interaction and facilitate cohesiveness within groups and provide a safe environment for communication and build positive relationships. So some of the things that they could customize for your board, some of the topics include conflict styles, true colors, going from good to great, leadership styles, and working with difficult people. So if you would like to look at that and are interested in perhaps customizing some of those components, feel free to call Solid or our office to get more information. And the last thing I'd like to share is the department is holding licensing and enforcement work groups. And as you know, we are committed to ensuring consumers are protected, and those are the two areas we want to gather and partner with our boards and bureaus to share some best practices. So we will be launching that in April, and we hope to get some participation from your board as well. And that concludes my update for today. Do you have any questions? You do. Mr. Kaiser.
The training that Solid provides, what does the delivery mechanism look like? Is it something that members would come individually and attend a class, or? And the reason I ask is that we have a training component on our agenda today,
Sure.
and we've kind of started to make that a norm. But I'm actually looking for new material. This will be our last clear component of training. We've completed that part of the program, so we won't have to address it for a while. Is this something that we would schedule along with an existing board meeting, or is it something that they would go to attend, and then in that attendance, I'd ask Sawa about the Opens Meetings Act and having multiple members in the room if there's an exception for training?
So I believe it could be either or.
Okay.
My understanding is that Solid staff can come to a board meeting and perhaps attach it to the front end or the back end of a meeting. Now, with regard to whether it's open or whatnot, that's something I would let your counsel go ahead and advise you on.
Well, I think that if the entire board was interested in training, a good way to go might be to have Solid come in, give it to everyone all at once. Now, if only, one or two board members, less than a quorum, wanted training, then having them go in individually might be the way to go. Now, if all of them wanted to do the training, or a quorum wanted to do the training, or even enough of a quorum to create a committee wanted to do the training, I think they might be able to go still, as long as they don't communicate with each other about board business at the training. But then again, it sounds like the trainings might involve board issues, because I heard some information about customizing. So it'll really depend, I think, on the training. So I think one way to deal with it is as it comes up. So if any board members have indicated an interest in these trainings, then we can look at it on a case-by-case basis and see, do we have a quorum? Is the training gonna involve any discussion about board issues or communication, a discussion amongst the board members during the training? Those are all things we would look at. But, I'd be hesitant to say a rule here and now when it might involve a case-by-case basis. So long story short, I think we're gonna have to look at it more.
Yeah. I'm happy to hear about it, though. So, I'll reach out to Damon Nelson and try to schedule something for us in the future.
And I can try to gather some information as well as to how they can format these trainings for the board members.
Excellent.
So I can provide that information for you.
It sounds like its purpose is to build cohesiveness and teamwork and have us all get along, and I think we do pretty good in that department. Maybe after you take a look and see if there's something specific that you see as an executive officer that might be missing, that would be beneficial to us, that would be good. And I'd also like to invite board members to bring up any areas of training that you'd like to see to Jason. I know I've been on the board for 4 years, and I look through the agenda materials, and I'm still having light bulbs go off. Oh, that's what that is. And so, giving feedback to Jason about what you feel like you might want more information on or training on could be beneficial to many of us, I think.
Absolutely.
Alicia, thank you for saying that, because are these trainings, they're separate, or is the boot camp, when we do this training, does it cover all of these topics? Because you named a list of
Yes.
different topics.
So there are a menu of items, and from my understanding, you can pick and choose which one the board would like to go ahead and have as
So
a
we'd
training.
have to decide.
Yeah, a good number
we
of
wanted.
the trainings that Ms. Nelson listed are trainings that we have available to us for staff. And so they're a la carte. I mean, we could, take one particular, training off of that list and do it at one board meeting and then another one at the next, and so on and so forth. So I'm glad to hear that Solid has looked at executive leadership and board members in particular to provide that.
I have a question for you, Karen. Does participating in the board boot camp count as your board member training for the year? Would that, since it's the same provider and potentially the same amount of hours?
To clarify, do you mean the board member orientation training?
Correct.
It would be different.
It would be different.
It would be different.
Okay.
Yeah, the April event with the increase in participation between boards, can you speak to that a little bit more?
The April 30th
Was it April
directors,
30th?
April 30th directors quarterly meeting. So that is a quarterly meeting with executive officers and bureau chiefs. The first one in January was included. We had our board presidents included as well, and President Rubina Aman was there and was able to participate and hear about what was happening with the department, and also provide an avenue in which we can have some dialogue about other things the boards are, as a whole, would like to discuss in future discussions. Any other questions?
I just want to point out and clarify, I mean, there are examples of board members attending trainings not in a meeting, like the BMOT is one example. And also maybe attending a social gathering where board issues are not being discussed is another example. So if it were like to develop relationships at these trainings, might fall into that category. But again, looking at a case-by-case basis, you can't have, there are a lot of factors you'd have to look at. But those are some examples of where it might fall into.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any further board questions or comments? Ms. Nelson, any public comment at all? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you again.
Likewise.
Okay. So at this point, we can either go into closed or go into training. Either way, we'll take a break. It's 10:30 or 10:23 right now. Do you have a preference for which way we go?
I'm good either way.
Let's do a break and then decide.
Yeah, break absolutely for
And then
either.
decide.
But if we go into a break and we go into the training, you have to set up, right?
Yep.
So that's why I want to decide now.
How long's the training?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me pull it up real quick. They're usually about 40 to 45 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, let's go into the training after break. So let's take a 10-minute recess and come back at around 10:33, 10:35, 12-minute recess. Back from recess. It is 10:45, and we are moving on to the CLEAR training. Did our executive officer leave? Yes, he had to step out. Oh. So we are going to start the CLEAR training.
Had nothing to do with it, so I don't know.
Yeah, you want to try?
Yeah, I could play it. I can play it. It's not. I can play it. You can play it. Yeah. I don't know if I'm supposed to do it or not.
Yes. Thank you, Susan.
No problem.
So again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's CLEAR Board Member Training Introduction to Regulatory Governance webinar. Today's module is Professional Discipline. I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Bruce Matthews is a consultant who provides analysis, support, and training services to professional and occupational regulatory organizations. A professional engineer by education and training, Bruce has over 17 years of professional regulatory experience covering a breadth of professions and occupations in Ontario, including engineering, real estate, and most recently the skilled trades. He began his regulatory career as an investigator and has spent spent the past 9 years in executive leadership roles. A sought-after speaker and presenter, Bruce is a past president of CLEAR and served on the CLEAR Board of Directors from 2007 to 2014. In addition to serving as an instructor for CLEAR's board member training, Bruce is on the faculty of CLEAR's Executive Leadership for Regulators program, and he has played a leading role in the development and growth of CLEAR's regional symposia programs. So with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to our speaker today. Thank you so much.
Stephanie, and good afternoon or morning or whatever the appropriate salutation is for whatever time zone you may be in today. I'm pleased to be presenting this particular module of the board member training program. The first question we should really talk about is why professional discipline and the complaints process type issues are important for board members to understand and be aware of. And the reality is that as much as we are concerned with public protection with respect to setting standards of qualification and standards of practice, the main public interface we often have as regulators is unfortunately through the discipline process. The public may not even know that you exist as a regulatory body until such time as they have problems with dealing with one of your regulated professionals. So this is really, frankly, the most public-facing element of what we see in the world of professional regulation. So as a result, the opinion and the level of confidence that the public is going to have in your organization is largely going to be formed because of this particular issue. So their ability to deal with and get their concerns addressed is going to affect public perception and therefore public confidence. It is a key aspect of your responsibilities as a board member or a council member to ensure that your organization has a properly functioning complaints and discipline process that really goes key to one of your fundamental duties in that role. And as a result of that, it's important that as a board, everybody understands the policies and procedures that take place and are related to the complaints and discipline process. And just as important is the fact that as board members, many of you will likely be serving as in an adjudication at a disciplinary or a complaints committee type hearing. So there's different roles, and it's important to understand sort of what the good, bad, and the ugly, shall we say, with respect to what goes on in the world of complaints and discipline. Now, this, of course, is targeted at a fairly broad audience, both geographically and range of professions and so on. So clearly, my overall caveat here is to say, your mileage may vary in terms of some of the specifics. Please refer to your legislation. I am certainly quite familiar with everything that goes on in Ontario and very much across Canada, and I have a certain level of awareness of some of the rules and procedures that exist in the U.S. and internationally. But I'm going to try and take a slightly higher level view. I don't want to try and specify or suggest too many specifics that are only true in specific jurisdictions. However, that being said, fundamentally, what we call the enforcement process or the complaints discipline process for a regulatory organization, they all follow generally this same structure of 7 steps. There's the initial intake, an assessment, an investigation that takes place, some sort of review or screening after the investigation is complete, a resolution process, which can be formal or informal, then findings are made, perhaps an order being issued based on what those findings are, and then where there is an order that's issued, how one deals with compliance. So some of the terminology is going to be different from one jurisdiction to another, but essentially you can break down just about everybody's enforcement process into these particular steps, and we're going to look at each of these now in a little bit more detail. So to begin, we look at the idea of intake, and this is really that first interface between the complainant, the person in the public, the patient, the client of your practitioner, who wants to bring to your attention concerns they have with respect to their dealing with that particular practitioner. So you need to have processes set up in-house to be able to receive and acknowledge a particular complaint. And generally speaking, it is a good idea to ensure that the practitioner themselves are notified that a complaint has been received. There can be some exceptions on particular circumstances where you may delay notification of the practitioner, but generally speaking, having them in the loop sooner than later is beneficial. You have to decide in terms of as an organization in what form are you going to accept complaints? Are you going to simply take them over the phone? Are you going to require them to be on a particular written form? Are you going to provide something through your website that allows for submission of complaints? Will you simply accept a letter that's being written by someone, even though it's, let's say it's unstructured, if it has all the important elements of identifying the practitioner and identifying the concerns, do you say that's enough to now initiate the process? And again, there's no right or wrong. There's pluses and minuses on both sides, but you do need a process. You need policies in place to decide what is it you're going to take. Other consideration at this point is even, are you going to take anonymous complaints? Someone phones in, they don't want to give you a name, but they'll go into details about some fairly serious misconduct allegations, and how do you choose you want to proceed that way? You receive an anonymous letter, the same sort of situation. Do you actually want to accept that to initiate a complaint, or are you going to establish policies that say, no, the complainant needs to be identified? Again, pluses and minuses either way that way. So as part of this process and what you need to do in-house is obviously you have some methods of setting up a file, opening up a file. Once you've decided, yes, this complaint meets our parameters to be accepted as a complaint, odds are you're going to assign it a number, which provides for a tracking mechanism. Nowadays, most regulators will have something as part of their computer-based systems, but there are a lot of case management systems out there, either as part of a greater package of member or practitioner database and record keeping for registration, may also have a separate complaint tracking aspect to it, or you may have a standalone case management system. But either way, you need some method for when your complainant calls you back in 2 weeks and wants to know the status. You've got some method of easily recognizing that without having to necessarily speak directly to the investigator that's involved. So once you've got the intake done, there is going to be some level of initial screening. Clearly, you need to know a few different things. First of all, is the complaint within your jurisdiction? So are they complaining about one of your practitioners? And is the nature of the complaint something that falls within the purview of your powers under your governing legislation? And the example I can give, of course, is, I can tell you when I was with professional engineers, we had someone file a complaint because allegedly an engineer was having an affair with the complainant's wife. May have been true, maybe not, I don't know, but I can assure you that that kind of conduct, having nothing to do with the practice of engineering, was outside of our jurisdiction, and we did not proceed with that matter as a complaint. Couldn't open a file because of that. So you do need to determine have you got the actual jurisdiction based on A, who's being identified, and B, what the nature of those allegations are. Next thing you're going to want to look at, if the nature of the allegations are sufficiently serious and maybe the complainant has provided enough prima facie type evidence that you think there's a risk to the public with respect to the ongoing practice of your practitioner, should you be invoking interim measures to either suspend or restrict the practice of that individual? Now, that's a fairly extreme action, and it does require a very careful risk analysis. But as a body that is responsible for public welfare protection, it's certainly something to consider, assuming that you have the authority under your legislation. And then the other thing this initial screening may look at is, based on the nature of the issues that are being complained about, do you have some alternative resolution mechanisms that are perhaps a better way for the concerns to be dealt with rather than going through your more formal investigative process? So most of the regulators that I've worked for did implement some kind of ADR, alternative dispute resolution mechanism, to deal with what I'm going to call less serious type allegations, things that are perhaps isolated to personality conflicts, a few other things where at least you can provide some satisfaction to the complainant, but it's not going to lead down the road to some sort of formal disciplinary action. And you can hopefully arrive at a resolution that's mutually satisfactory to all the parties involved. So that's the aspect of doing that initial screening. If you've gone through that, and what we're going to assume for the purposes of this presentation is you've got jurisdiction, you may or may not have done some interim measures, but we're going to talk about the things that aren't being sent off to alternative dispute resolution. So With that in mind, we then move on to the phase of actual investigation. This is where the complaint now gets assigned to an individual investigator or an investigative team, depending on how your organization is set up. Again, depending on the size of your regulatory organization, you may have in-house investigators. You may contract out to third-party investigators to handle this part. And really, investigation is just all about evidence gathering in relation to the allegations that have been made. And evidence gathering involves interviews with all of the parties involved, certainly the complainant, quite likely the practitioner themselves, and if there are third parties who are witnesses or who have information that may be relevant to the circumstances, they'll be interviewed as well. And then most importantly is, frankly, the identification and seeking and obtaining of all the relevant documentation. Because what tends to happen, and we'll talk about this in a moment with respect to actual discipline hearings and complaint reviews, this is a very paper-intensive exercise. Notwithstanding that what happened between practitioner and client or practitioner and patient may be a bit more esoteric, really by the time we're at this stage and when we have the context of a hearing, having documentary evidence is much more supportive than just purely the verbal evidence, the testimony of individuals. So when all of this investigation work is done, the evidence gathering is complete, the investigator or the team will usually produce an investigation report that summarizes what was done, what the findings of the investigation are, just in terms of facts. Clearly, the investigators aren't there to make conclusions in terms of what constitutes professional misconduct or not, but they're there to say, here's the evidence that shows this, provide all that evidence as appendices to that report as well. Now, I'll tell you, and this is important for folks who are board members and working on complaints committees and so on to know, the toughest job an investigator has is to know when they are done, right? When they are done with respect to that evidence gathering information. Because, frankly, an investigation goes where the evidence leads it. So as much as the initial complaint was about thing A, and as you gather evidence about thing A, you've got information that suggests, well, hang on, there's some other risk issues here or some other potential misconduct issues that haven't been raised by at least not raised directly by the complainant, but you've now got that information and you may need to take your investigation in a slightly different direction to gather the totality of the information that's required. So it's really a bit of a challenge and a bit of a skill on the part of the investigator to say, do I have everything that is necessary for the next step, for the people who are going to be screening this complaint to say, yes, there's enough information. It can either be referred on to discipline or whatever other decision needs to be made. So that's a big challenge for an investigator. And these things do take time, and I'll talk about timeliness in a few minutes. So the next step then, after that investigation report is prepared, generally speaking, it goes to some form of a screening committee. It might be called a complaint committee. It might be called an investigation committee. Terminology is really not that important. The idea, their job is to take complaints and the results of the investigation and then determine what happens next. They make no finding of fact. They make no finding of culpability of any kind. They just do a bit of a weigh and sift of the evidence to say, is there any merit to this complaint? And really, one of the key questions they need to ask themselves is, what is in the best public interest to do at this point going forward? Because even in the face of a complaint, I'm going to suggest, let's say it's a minor issue, and yes, there's evidence that clearly there was a breach of some kind, but the time and effort involved in a discipline hearing may not be warranted by virtue of the nature of the violation. So while there may be merit, and it's got to move forward in some form, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to move on to an actual discipline hearing. I'll get to that portion in a moment. But clearly, complaints that have no merit whatsoever, where the evidence has shown the practitioner worked in accordance with the standards that are established, and nor the allegations certainly can't be made out that the complainant may be embellishing or otherwise, those things simply have to be closed out, and clearly reasons get provided back to the complainant. But let's look now at things that, again, we'll assume that there was merit to the complaint and where we go from here. So we know we're looking at the issue of providing some form of resolution, and these things sort of take Two forms I'm going to talk about. First is the confidential or informal resolution, and then the next slide we'll get into what I call the public or more formal resolution. So a confidential or informal resolution is one that would be sort of addressed and taken care of and acted on by the screening committee itself. So again, check your legislation in terms of what's provided for, allowed, or otherwise. But in most jurisdictions, it is possible for a complaint committee to do certain things by way of acknowledging that a complaint has merit, but perhaps is less serious and doesn't warrant formal disciplinary proceedings, that they have some powers in their toolbox to issue, for example, some kind of a written or oral caution. And again, the specific wording here clearly it probably doesn't go to the level of a reprimand. Reprimands are usually considered a disciplinary action and tend to be on the record, but it is possible perhaps for the complaints committee or your review committee to issue some kind of a caution. It may be possible to accept from the practitioner some kind of irrevocable undertaking, where they come to you, knowing that the complaint is there, knowing the complaint has merit. The practitioner comes to you and says, I will give you my undertaking that I will not do this in the future, or that I will do a certain thing that perhaps provides some level of remediation. And again, it's not so much necessarily a legally binding, because there's no specific provision in your legislation for it per se, but it may provide sufficient comfort for the complaints committee to accept that. And clearly, if there's evidence that the undertaking gets breached in the future, that by itself becomes a misconduct issue where a practitioner has basically broken their agreement with the regulator, and that can become the subject of another complaint. Similarly, it may be, most legislation doesn't provide much in terms of remediation or restitution back to a complainant, but it's entirely possible that, again, based on a proposal from the practitioner themselves, that either they're going to undertake a certain kind of remediation or they're going to provide restitution of some kind back to the complainant. That may be sufficient in the totality of the circumstances to allow the complaint committee to say, okay, you know what, in the public interest, that is sort of sufficient, and we don't need to move this thing anywhere forward. So those are the kinds of options that are available. Again, I talk about this in the context of being confidential. Generally speaking, these kinds of resolutions don't get made public, although the complainant might be told about it. Again, it's going to vary from one jurisdiction to another. But I can tell you that there is a lot of pressure right now with respect to more openness in the area of professional discipline, and you certainly get the media and some members of public interest groups who are saying, no, we want to know if a practitioner has received this kind of caution or has provided this kind of undertaking as a result of a complaint matter, even if again, there's been no formal findings against this individual. This is where it's a bit of a house of cards. The person's not been found guilty of anything. They've done this as part of an agreement, or they understand the caution has no formal weight to it. Why should that be public information? So huge debates going on with respect to that, and that's certainly a thing to bring to bear based on where the pendulum is with respect to the issue of openness in your current jurisdiction. So it's certainly a very live issue to be considered. But let's move on from that then and talk now about the more formal circumstances. So where the complaints committee, review committee has had a look, and they've decided that not only does the complaint have merit, but the nature of the circumstances and the nature of the evidence that they've seen suggests that some kind of formal disciplinary process is required. And again, it's important to realize if you are in that role of that screening committee, of that complaints committee or review committee, you are not making findings to say the person is guilty. And in fact, your role at that stage is not even to say to yourself, if this was the evidence and I was at a discipline hearing, I would find the person guilty. That's really not where you want your headspace to be in that particular role. It's really a matter of saying, are the nature of the concerns sufficiently high that, again, in the public interest, it is best to move this on to a more formal disciplinary process where there will be an actual hearing and structure and things that are out more a bit in the public and get more openness and transparency from that perspective. So again, the fact that a matter has been referred to a discipline hearing should not be some sort of automatic belief, therefore, that the person is indeed guilty of professional misconduct or that the allegations are guaranteed to be proven. All right, this is really a referral onto another process. So the actual process then with respect to a formal resolution is one of very much a discipline hearing is very much like a trial that you get in the courts. You will have the college or the board, a prosecutor acting as prosecution. The practitioner is the defendant. He may or may not retain legal counsel to represent him or her at those proceedings. But it does go very much structured, not unlike a discipline, not like a court case. The onus is on the board, the college, the prosecutor to prove the case. There is the presumption of innocence and so on. The standard of proof is simply one of a balance of probabilities. It doesn't go to an issue of beyond reasonable doubt, but it does still have that particular kind of structure. Discipline hearings are usually before either a discipline committee, it might be the committee of a whole, depending on the size of the organization, but more often than not, it's a panel of probably between 3 to 5 individuals who are going to sit in judgment. They sort of serve as the judges for these kinds of proceedings. And again, depending on the jurisdiction, that overall panel will be made up of a mix of people who have the professional background from that particular area of practice. Also, though, you likely have 1, 2, or possibly more lay people, so people who certainly they understand they're involved in the board or the council as a lay person, but they end up serving on the committee to ensure again that there's good public interest representation from that perspective. I can tell you that a formal resolution hearing is a very time-consuming and expensive option because generally, of course, the board of the college may end up retaining external prosecutorial counsel if they're not big enough to have their own in-house prosecutor. They will also end up retaining counsel as independent legal counsel to the committee itself, so the committee can have its own independent legal advice on issues of procedure or evidence and so on. So it's getting these lawyers involved, getting all the parties lined up takes time. Depending on the nature of the allegations, if it's a fully contested hearing where sort of every sort of issue is going to be challenged, you can be looking at things that run for several days. So this gets to be a fairly expensive option. There are ways, of course, of trying to pare that down, and certainly my approach when I'm representing prosecution at the regulators that I've worked for is always to first look at, can we get some agreements about what the facts are? If the facts aren't really an issue, then let's put together an agreed statement of facts. We don't have to call a bunch of witnesses to say things that everybody agrees are already the truth anyway. So let's get the facts on paper, submitted jointly as an agreed statement of facts that will be part of the evidence that the discipline committee has to rely upon for their deliberations. And once I've got that in place, I'll say, all right, look, if we've got the agreed statement of facts, can't you see how those facts lead to a conclusion that there was misconduct? And maybe we can get a plea to say, all right, based on these facts, the person's going to plead guilty to misconduct or whatever the official language is in, be it incompetence, be it whatever, in your jurisdiction. So if you've got the facts agreed already, maybe there's a nice logical one step to say, look, it's obvious then, those are the facts, this meets the definition of misconduct, and we can at least get an agreement to a plea. And in a perfect world, once we've got that step as well, I would then encourage working with the other party to say, all right, if you're going to make the agreement to plea, then let's talk about what we're going to jointly submit as a penalty issue. And I'll talk about penalty circumstances momentarily. But, I'd like to try to follow those logical kind of steps. If we agreed on facts, then it should be easy to show how the facts make misconduct. And if you're going to plead to misconduct, let's talk about how that that level, that nature of misconduct works out in terms of penalty. Now, I can tell you the reality, when I first end up discussing with the legal counsel that represents a practitioner, their first question to me is, what are you looking for in terms of penalty? So they almost want to do the process backwards, right? They want to know, are we looking for a suspension? Are we looking for making the person write an exam? Are we looking for revocation? You know, what's on the table in terms of actual penalty? And then it's like they'd want to work backwards. So if we tell them, well, the penalty is going to be, you know, a 2-month suspension and a requirement to write an exam, and they say, okay, yeah, all right, based on that, my guy will now be willing to plead guilty, to which is like, well, okay, but what's he pleading guilty to? We've still got to go backwards and say, what are the actual facts? And to me, that's really a tough direction to try and work your negotiations, because it may not be, notwithstanding accepting the penalty and willing to plead, you can still get a huge cat fight about what are the actual facts that they're willing to agree to, because clearly it's still going to be in their interest to minimize the facts that will make their client look more culpable, more guilty, and put them more in bad light. So it's really, from my perspective, start from the facts, work through to the plea, and then to the penalty. And of course, this is really the job of your prosecutorial staff, and not those who are sitting on the panel themselves, but just to understand that there is a process that can happen, and just because someone comes to you with, you know, you've got an agreed statement of facts, there's going to be a plea and a joint submission on penalty, doesn't mean that you don't have work to do as the actual committee members sitting in the panel. And that's where we get to the next step, which is all about making findings and issuing an order. So the discipline panel itself, their job is to adjudicate the matter. They have to listen to the evidence that is presented, and that's the only thing they can determine the facts based on is the evidence, and there may be expert evidence in there as well. They do make findings. They make findings of fact, and will make findings of guilt or culpability with respect to professional misconduct. And assuming they make findings of guilt or culpability, they will then order particular sanctions. Again, I'll talk about that in a second. And most importantly, there has to be a written decision that gets issued at the end of the process that includes the reasons that went into their decision-making, both in terms of why they made the findings that they made and why the sanctions were ordered that were ordered, all right? So like I said, it is still important, even in cases where there is a agreed statement of fact and a plea and a joint submission on penalty. These are still important steps that this one panel has to take. This isn't a rubber stamping exercise, and it shouldn't be viewed as a rubber stamping exercise. You should look at what's being admitted to, and in your own minds, do you think that actually constitutes professional misconduct in terms of what's being pleaded to? And then most importantly, does the sanction that's being recommended by the two parties jointly as a joint submission on penalty, does that make sense in the overall context and the overall job of serving and protecting the public interest? Because the last thing you want to have is a serious set of allegations and someone get the lightest slap on the wrist, because that's going to seriously impact public perspective of the regulator. Again, this is going to vary a little bit by jurisdiction, but of course the decisions and the orders that are issued, they can be appealed depending on the jurisdiction. Sometimes the first level of appeal is still internal to the board or college. Sometimes it immediately goes external. And usually that can then, whatever that first level is, there's probably a second level of appeal that would certainly go to the external courts and run that particular process. I know that a lot of discipline panels sort of wring their hands and spend a lot of time fretting about making, or essentially fretting about the idea that their decision is going to be appealed. And therefore, it's like they want to spend the time and effort to ensure that what they do is appeal-proof. And while I think there's a certain validity to that, I think panels have this tendency to get a little bit wrapped around the axle, maybe being sometimes a bit too cautious and concerned about that, because the fact is, you know, the practitioner and or the college or board itself, they're going to do what they're going to do. If they truly don't like the decision, if it's been a truly contested case, you know, they may just on principle decide that they're going to appeal. And if it's appealed and overturned, I don't worry about it reflecting badly per se on the discipline panel. You know, things happen, and I would just suggest that panels not spend an awful lot of time worrying about this idea of, well, if we say this, is it going to get appealed? All right, you need to do what you need to do in terms of making your findings and documenting your sanctions, and take it from there and let the chips fall where they may. So once we're through with all of this process, and let's say a guilty finding is made and some sort of sanction is ordered and you've issued the written decision and the practitioner has decided not to appeal, the next step is all about compliance. All right, the board, as in the overall organization, has to monitor compliance with the sanctions that have been ordered. And this is not the job of the discipline panel. Once the hearing is over, the discipline panel is, that's what they call functus, for those who love the real Latin kind of stuff. But they're done with their work. They wipe their hands and go on to the next case. The job of monitoring compliance with a sanction is within the staff of the regulatory organization. They're the ones who must follow through, where if the order is that the person be suspended, let's say for 3 months, that they make the changes online or on the system that indicates, yes, this individual is suspended, and make sure that the practitioner knows that they're suspended and what that means in terms of their ability to actually carry out their work. Now, one of the challenges I know that some discipline panels face, of course, is, how do you handle non-compliance with an order? And I can tell you, okay, I've just lost my controls here. Just hang on a second. Oh, there we go. I'm back. Sorry. One of the concerns is that, and I'll give you an example. When I was with professional engineers, they would give you an order that says, okay, so-and-so has to pass a certain exam within 6 months. And the 6 months would go by, and even though the person was told they have to pass this, they don't pass it. Now what? All right? There is nothing in the order that says, and if they don't, what happens? Right? They were just ordered to do this. So now they're in the violation of an order of the discipline committee, but the legislation that existed at the time, you'd almost have to start a new complaint process to say, we're now complaining and processing this on the basis of non-compliance with an order, rather than the particular issues that started the complaint in the first place. So it gets a little bit messy if you don't have good, hard language that sort of captures all of the what-ifs. So instead of simply saying the person shall write an exam within a certain period of time, and the language should then say, and if they fail to do that, something like their license will be suspended for 2 months. And, of course, what happens at the end of 2 months? Do they just get the license back? Well, you have to say no. And if they still haven't written it after that 2-month suspension period, that the license gets revoked, or something to that effect anyways. But something that sort of crosses off all the particular routes and paths, so that those who have to monitor compliance and sort of impose this penalty and sanction, they know what all the options are. They don't sort of leave anything loose ends hanging that it becomes uncertain. You suddenly have to bring the person back or the practitioner back into another disciplinary process. So it's important that the sanction orders should include something about consequences of particular non-compliance. So that, just as a quick recap, is the key bits of the process. Like I said, some of the very specific details will vary from jurisdiction to another, but that's the general flow that you're always going to get. So I want to talk now about the idea of what constitutes a strong enforcement process or strong complaints and discipline process. First of all, it needs to be well publicized. There's nothing more useless, frankly, for you guys to be as a regulatory organization if no one knows how to access your processes. So through your website, through telephone, through whatever else you want to use in terms of brochures, to let people know what it is you're all about, how the particular process works, and it's information that you want to direct both to members of the public, but also to ensure that your practitioners are aware of as well. And I can tell you that I've worked with a couple of regulatory organizations where there were separate sort of brochure publications also available online. One was directed to a complainant, usually a member of the public, about how to make a complaint, and then another publication directed to the practitioners to say, what happens if a complaint is filed against you. So they've got that information about the process. Everything is sort of above board and open, try to maximize your transparency with respect to that. I talked about openness earlier, and I think openness is a bit of a kettle of fish, but frankly, transparency of process for people to understand what happens and how it happens, you can't have enough. Frankly, there's no such thing as too much transparency about what you do as a regulator. So it's really important to ensure that your processes are well publicized and hopefully easily understood. Which then moves on to the second bullet, which again is to say that your process needs to be well organized. It does need to be open to a certain extent in terms of information, but most important is that aspect of transparency, that people can understand how things happen. They're certainly not entitled to be, the deliberations of the discipline committee don't take place in public. Typically, the screening activity of a review committee or a complaints committee doesn't take place in public either, so it's not always transparent, not always open that way, but the fact of what gets considered and how that process works should certainly be out there and provided to the public. Next one here is key. Operates in a timely manner. That's a very careful use of words, I can tell you, in terms of creating this slide, because when someone files a complaint with a regulatory organization, I can tell you that there are two things that they want. First, they want you to revoke the registration or license of the person they're complaining about, and they want you to do it tomorrow. All right, that's the way many complainants who are, they're emotionally charged up, are grieved, perhaps legitimately, perhaps not, but usually they'll come in and say, even on minor infractions, I want so-and-so's license revoked, and you got to do that tomorrow before he does this to someone else, kind of thing. That's all well and good. Frankly, not realistic in a sort of democratic society that we have, where we assume innocence until proven guilty, and notwithstanding the fact that the complainant will tell you, well, you've got all the information you need right here, why can't you revoke the license tomorrow? What is important, though, is that you have something that's reasonably timely. So when a complaint is received, you're not waiting a year or something before your investigation is finished. Now, what constitutes timely? It's going to vary a little bit from one jurisdiction to another, and sort of, I don't like to suggest there's a universal number, but I would say, an investigation on the more straightforward kind of matters really should be handled inside of 2 to 3 months, maybe. Is not a reasonable time to get to that stage of having a complaints committee review it. And, of course, if the matter goes on to a discipline hearing, you're now talking about scheduling things and more formal. You might end up going another 6, 9, almost 12 months after that point before the matter is fully disposed of. And those aren't unreasonable times. It's just a matter of making the person, the complainant, aware. And, of course, that information should be included in that aspect of being well publicized, any information that's provided on your website and so on. A strong process avoids the appearance of institutional bias. What is meant by institutional bias is that you have not built something into your process that seems to favor either the practitioner or a complainant, or that there are things that can happen within the process that are going to potentially introduce again, it's not actual bias, it's just the appearance of bias alone is really all that matters, and that's enough to get things thrown out. And I can tell you, prior to my point of joining Professional Engineers Ontario back in the year 2000, a couple of years before I got there, they actually had a discipline matter where an issue got appealed and there was concerns raised about institutional bias because the person who was in charge of the investigation, sort of the manager of the investigators, was also the person who selected who from the discipline committee was going to serve on the discipline panel to hear the case. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out, well, hang on, that person could use their knowledge of the case to cherry pick members of a discipline panel who are going to perhaps give a more, either favorable or contrary type of position. So that appeal was successful on that basis, and the organization changed its procedures so that the selection of discipline panels is done, shall we say, with a Chinese wall between the investigation side of the house and that kind of prosecution and setting up the court system. But it's those kind of issues you need to be aware of. The other thing a strong enforcement process does is going to have very clearly defined words for what is or is not misconduct or incompetence or whatever other offenses are defined under your legislation. They do need to be defined clearly. The clearer they can be, the easier the job is for investigators and the complaints committee and your discipline hearings to determine whether misconduct has taken place. Now, that being said, I know there will always be what are referred to as basket clauses with respect to conduct that speak to, misconduct that would be regarded as, or reasonably regarded as disgraceful, dishonorable, unprofessional. What do those words really mean? Well, and that's fair. Those things will always have to be there. But on the specifics, the more definitive you can be with respect to those definitions, the better. And I appreciate you don't necessarily have direct control of those definitions if they either appear in your legislation or in the associated regulations. But if they can be defined in rules or in regulations that you do have control over, then there's some opportunity there to ensure that you're being as clear as absolutely possible. And then the last thing with respect to a strong enforcement process is that you have internal consistency. And what this means is that two cases that are fundamentally the same, and I'll be the first person to tell you, having investigated literally hundreds upon hundreds of cases, be it engineers or real estate folks, is that no two cases are ever actually identical. There's always some subtle differences. But, on the whole, at that 10,000-foot level, if you've got similar conduct that's being complained about, should result in similar outcomes. All right? It's that kind of internal consistency that you want. The last thing you want to have happen is that, in January, there's a discipline hearing about thing A, and the person receives a 2-month suspension. And then in June or July, there's another individual who's addressed with thing B, but boy, it looks and smells an awful lot like thing A, and yet that person gets their license revoked. All right, that kind of inconsistency is very bad for the organization. It's bad for the public impression of the organization. It's almost like left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So it's important to have internal consistency, and you achieve that by having internal policies in place that are well communicated and well understood by the various players at the decision-making points. That includes the complaints committee and the screening committee people, as well as those who are going to be serving on discipline panels. So it's really absolutely critical that there, again, be that kind of consistency. Now, that being said, I'll also be the first person to say, if over the course of time, let's say the span of a few years, you keep getting repeats of the same kind of conduct by a bunch of different practitioners, and let's say the first one comes in, and they get a 1-month suspension. Of course, you publicize that fact, and then another one comes in and you give them a 1-month suspension. And let's say you've done 3 or 4 of these over the span of a couple of years. It's not unreasonable to come to the conclusion that your sanctions aren't being effective enough in terms of deterrence. And I'll talk about that again in a little bit in terms of why one has sanctions. But as much as you want internal consistency, you do want to make sure that you're having the appropriate deterrent level, and that may require things to be escalated over time. So let's move on now and just talk about sanctions in general. It may sound like a trite kind of question, but why do we have disciplinary sanctions at the end of such a process? Because I know those who are involved in going through the process, if you're a practitioner facing allegations and so on, just going through the process is a pretty big impact all by itself. It's going to have all sorts of deterrent value for sure. But ultimately, as a regulatory organization, you're there to protect the public. You want to have the public have confidence in the board or the council and the overall organization. And then there's that issue of deterrence. You don't want the conduct to be repeated. And there's 2 forms of the deterrence there. First, there is specific deterrence to that individual. So if John or Jane Smith is in front of you as a discipline panel, you want to make sure that they get the message, that they feel enough of a sting that's going to be a deterrent from them repeating the conduct. But then by virtue of communication and publication of disciplinary decisions, you want to ensure that there's deterrence to the general practitioner population at large, that others can learn from the mistakes of this one poor individual who happened to get complained against and caught, so that people understand that there are indeed consequences to certain kinds of misconduct. And I can tell you, I've heard any number of practitioners say upon reading a disciplinary decision that's been published about somebody else saying, holy crap, I've done the same thing myself, or I've come close to doing something similar to that. And they end up learning, where the lines are drawn. It really helps with respect to preventing future misconduct. And and it's unfortunate that we put this last on the list because, frankly, sometimes I think it really should be first, is the idea of rehabilitation. A discipline hearing isn't about revocation. It's not always about booting somebody from the profession. Given the time and effort that people expend in terms of getting their initial training and education and registration and however many years of practice they had, to throw that all overboard for relatively minor things or even medium things shouldn't be the first recourse. You really should first think about how can we close the gap in terms of this person's knowledge or skills or judgment, or what can we do to rehabilitate this person and bring them back into the fold of the profession so that we're comfortable that they are going to continue to practice in a way that isn't going to be problematic for the public. So that really needs to be a little bit more foremost in mind before you get into the other sort of available sanctions. Now, the other thing that a discipline committee has to consider are what they call aggravating or mitigating circumstances. And this really comes down to a number of different things. And this is also where I say no two complaints or no two discipline matters are ever the same, because even when the allegations are the same, even when the nature of the misconduct on the surface in terms of which chapter and verse they're in violation of might be the same, there can be a bunch of different things that are identified in this list. So, is this the third time you've dealt with this person for this particular misconduct, or is it just their first appearance? Is the complaint all about a singular event, or were there 10 complainants talking about a pattern of conduct? Did the individual cooperate with the investigation, or did they do things to try and mislead the board or the council or the organization? Have they demonstrated any level of insight and remorse? So all these things will either, in the bad side, ratchet up the seriousness of the sanction or potentially alleviate some of the seriousness of the sanction. So just to wrap up the last few slides here, sort of the sanction options that are available, you've really got to look to your own legislation, but generally these are the kinds of things that are available. Revocation is what's referred to as the professional death penalty, but even then, death usually isn't permanent. Most legislation does allow for the possibility of somebody being reinstated after revocation, but usually after a period of time, 2 years, 5 years, something along those lines. And then sort of scaling down from revocation, you've got suspension, where they're not allowed to practice for a stated period of time. You can impose restrictions on their practice, and the restrictions can be either inclusive or exclusive, i.e. you are only allowed now to practice in this area, or you can practice in everything but this particular area, those kinds of things. Imposing terms or conditions on their registration, requiring the completion of a course, having them undergo periodic inspections or some sort of formal monitoring process for a fixed period of time. Restitution orders may be possible. Again, most legislation doesn't provide for that, but I know that some does. And then right down to the lower end of the spectrum is the reprimand, which is sort of the harsh talking to, and potentially some monetary fine, which may get paid to the regulatory organization, it may go to the government at large. It varies from one to another. Now, in thinking about practitioner misconduct, there's sort of 4 different categories of things that may come to the organization's attention. And I do this not in the context specifically of discipline, but even in that initial complaint process, is to look at the kinds of things that might be complained about. So there's that core technical competence issue, being someone having demonstrated a lack of knowledge or skill or training that they just don't seem to know something they ought to know in terms of executing their particular practice. So as much as they may have met the standard of qualification, they just aren't meeting the standard of practice as it relates to some sort of a technical issue. Then there can be what I call behavioral issues, breaches of either a code of conduct or a code of ethics, a little bit more moralistic in some cases rather than technical, but those certain issues, like somebody drops the F-bomb and you're dealing with the client, they got into an argument and they pounded their fist on the table, just, bad behavior rather than their ability to actually practice as a practitioner. You may or may not have authority over business issues. Again, that varies from one regulator to another. There can be record-keeping issues, and maybe legislation or regulations that relate to advertising limitations, so you may get complaints that associate with that. Certainly when I was involved in the Real Estate Council of Ontario, we had a huge number of complaints that dealt with advertising because there were some definitive limitations in the legislation about that. And then we have what I call personal issues, which would be impairment, because of abuse of alcohol, drugs, or the person may have other sorts of convictions on their record. Certainly the impairment side, there's a lot of organizations now that tend to have what they call fitness to practice pathways that are they're similar to, but not necessarily equal to, a complaints discipline pathway. I know not everybody has this, but it certainly does need to be thought of a little bit differently than the other kinds of issues. So I don't put these all on equal footing, but again, it's a question of what does your legislation provide for. The fact that someone's misconduct or behavior was tied to a substance, an addiction problem, that's definitely something for consideration in terms of how you handle it and going forward. But you just need to keep in mind that there are sort of these four major groups of things to think about. And then to summarize before we'll take some questions, you do as an organization want to ensure that you're employing fair, transparent, and timely, however you wish to define timely, processes. You do want to provide for informal resolution options. You don't want every complaint that has a little bit of merit to suddenly run you into a formal discipline hearing. Again, what is in the public interest is always the first filter that you're going to pass all of your decision-making through. But I think you can find that a lot of ways that the public interest can still be served through an informal resolution for a complaint matter. And then, most importantly, you do want to provide specific training to those board or council members who are going to be involved in discipline proceedings. Sitting in the adjudication at a discipline panel is just not a normal part of the training for a practitioner who happens to be serving on a board or even for a layperson necessarily. Now, the world doesn't expect these people to be trained lawyers and judges and so on. Nonetheless, there is specific training that they should take advantage of to understand what the rules are, what the proceedings are, and so on. And I can tell you I've seen examples of inadequately trained individuals trying to chair a discipline hearing, and I've got to tell you, it was an absolute gong show. I felt personally embarrassed for the organization that I was representing, working on the prosecution side, and looking at the lawyer and the practitioner who are subject to discipline hearing, wondering what on earth is going on here. Who are these clowns, and why don't they know what they're doing, and so on. So it can be really quite a bad image when you consider that these discipline matters are held in public and open, that you do want to make sure people are trained and are familiar with what the procedures are and the steps that have to be taken throughout the course of a discipline hearing. So I will leave it at that, and at this point, Stephanie, happy to take any questions that people may have.
So we do have a question that's popped up saying, can you chat a little about the concept of governability?
Oh, super. Thanks, Charles. Appreciate that. The idea of governability, that you may encounter at some point along life's highway a practitioner who, while they've gone through all the right hoops to get registered, when they get out there in the real world, they tend not want to comply with sort of any of the regulatory regime that you provide. So you get complaints and they are perhaps non-responsive to the complaint, or they don't care, or otherwise. And in doing that, essentially show themselves as being ungovernable individuals. So I have had cases where a complaint was made, the information went out to the practitioner, they did not provide a response. The complaints committee heard the matter, referred it to discipline, the notice of hearing and everything went out, the person did not respond, and so on. So they were they knew we were holding the hearing, and they just sort of snubbed their nose, saying, they don't recognize that the college had jurisdiction over them. That's really what it comes down to, is that you get individuals who, once they get their license and they want to practice, fail to acknowledge that the college or the board actually does have jurisdiction over their conduct. And somebody who gets to that level, it can ultimately be seen as ungovernable. Even if they participate in the process and maybe they accept a slap on the wrist or some sanction, they end up repeating the misconduct. And they may see, frankly, the discipline process as simply the cost of doing business. I've seen that happen as well. That all you're going to do is give them a slap on the wrist and maybe fine them $1,000. Well, they're making $10,000 by virtue of doing what they're doing. They don't care. And even though you escalate and escalate, again, the people are not responsive and they are ultimately demonstrating to be ungovernable. If you get to that point, and it is a process, you really can't determine ungovernability sort of on a single instance. But frankly, people who have demonstrated themselves as being ungovernable, the only solution from the prosecutorial point of view is to seek revocation of their status. And of course, there are people who, even upon being revoked, will try and continue to practice, and that then brings you into the realm of a what I call an enforcement process that's different from what I described now, but enforcing against unlicensed or unauthorized practice, which is a whole other discussion, a whole other process that the regulator has to use. But there is that concept. We get someone who's truly intransigent in their ability to recognize the authority of the regulator. And they feel the need to do their own thing, they can demonstrate themselves as being ungovernable, that there's nothing you can do is going to recover that person, rehabilitate them into a way that's going to allow them to be a well-regarded, satisfactory practitioner, in which case, indeed, your only option is revocation.
All right. Well, thank you for that. We've had a comment saying that the presentation was very clear, so thank you for that feedback. I think that's what had come in through the chat so far. I'll kind of monitor
If people
that
have,
in the background.
I was going to say, when people get the slide, my contact information is there on the slides. I'm always happy to chat or exchange emails if you like. If you've got another question that you want to take offline, no problem. Happy to do that.
All right. Well, great. We appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I think that brings us to our closing time then. So Clear would like to thank our presenter today and thank all of you for participating in this board member training webinar. We hope that you enjoyed this presentation.
That concludes the last part of the Clear training. During the training, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty and the webcast stopped. So right now there's already a slide up for everybody to see that says we're in recess. We're going to fix that when we come back from lunch. So I think it's a good time right now to kind of break for lunch.